Miller. I'm one of the board members here at the Missouri Association for Museums and Archives. I am also the reference services manager at the Missouri State Archives. And it's through that position that we work with Ben and Sara with their project to use From the Page to index a lot of the records in our collection, hopefully. We're just kind of kicking off our first collection, and I'm sure we'll kind of talk about that as we go through, but I'll introduce Ben and Sara Brumfield with From the Page. They're going to kind of introduce us to the product. Obviously, this is a conversation like we do on the regular. So interrupt, ask questions, kind of as we go through. They'll show you the product. We'll talk about how we've used it and how some of the other institutions we know of have used it. And hopefully it'll be kind of a fun conversation with everyone. So Ben and Sara?
Yeah.
Thanks, Christina.
Yeah. So as Christina told us, this is much more of an informal conversation. So we do have a bit of a demo, but we're going to encourage you to interrupt us if you have any questions. I mean, it's really hard for us to see the chat for one thing, but another thing, this is informal. So just shout out any kind of question or comment. And as we go, I'm probably going to need your help with some of the handwriting and some of the documents we're transcribing. So I may have questions and may be asking you to shout out answers as we work through some of this material together. So we're going to talk about the software platform From the Page, which we run, which is a collaborative or crowdsourced transcription and indexing tool. And it's used by institutions that range from the UK National Archives down to individual historians or family historians working by themselves on things. So there's kind of a range of projects.
And they range the world from Australia, the UK, all over the US.
Yeah.
It's nothing in Asia yet, but.
Yeah. We're gonna kind of go through the basics of how the tool works, and then we're going to take a look at some example projects of other museums and archives, particularly ones that are on the smaller side, and just kind of the kinds of materials that they have chosen to feature that they think that their publics would be interested in working on them, working with them on. And then we'll kind of go into more advanced features and more of the things like the tools that Missouri, the state archives have collaborated with us through funding and feedback and testing to work on. And then we'll take it from there.
Yeah, and we'll show you kind of the behind the scenes, what a project owner sees, getting material in, getting material out, kind of the configuration steps, which are not that complicated. So
we hope.
We hope.
Yeah.
We try.
So I'm going to share my screen, but again, that does not mean that you can't just unmute yourself and speak up. And if you're more comfortable using the chat, Christina, is there any way that you could read out and holler anything anybody types into the chat at us? Because I have a terrible time doing both of those.
I will do that.
Okay.
I will watch.
Thank you.
And I'm going to share my screen and ask whether people can see the Anthony Wilkinson letter collection.
Yes.
Okay, so this is a collection of letters at the Guild Museum in Arcadia, California, which is a small town, a fairly small town outside of Los Angeles. And they have, do you remember how many letters? Something like 3,000 pages. It's not that many that they are transcribing.
They're working with high schoolers for some of it. I don't know about this particular example been pulled up.
So this is one particular letter that you can see they've scanned. It's a 2-page letter. They've scanned front and back of both of them. And we're going to dive in and work on transcribing page 3 that no one has transcribed yet. Okay, so this is the basic user interface. As you can see, it's pretty simple. There is an image on one side and a place to type on the other. And we try to keep that as simple as possible because, as we'll find out, and most of us know, reading old handwriting is hard enough. So let's see if we can type what this letter says. My old
Laundry
man, both we live forced squares from grandma Sterling's to from Aunt Emma's. So you see, I am well fixed. I could not sleep the first 2 or 3 nights for the cars, and we live 3 doors from the corner. And you know how they ring the bell, the crossings. I wonder if those are streetcars. That's interesting.
Well, I wish you
I wish you
could see
the house and me sitting down. Thought must write a little. Now, if you don't answer soon, you will get it. I hired, H-I-A-R-D, a girl one day and sent her off the next. So Mr. S, Maggie, and Frank and I are getting along nice. I expect sis here
tomorrow to help.
All right, so we're going to save that.
So one of the philosophies when we started building from the page over 16 years ago is when Wikipedia was kind of starting to come to, at least if you were geeky people like us, into the consciousness. And we were really, really inspired by its model of collaborative knowledge creation. So this idea that you don't have to know everything, but you can take a first stab at it and then iterate and have other people contribute, and that the end product is better because multiple eyes have been on it, multiple people have been working on it. You're not going to show the version difference yet?
I will after
Okay.
I'm finished fixing
all
my
the things.
typos, yes.
So the idea that, Ben transcribed this, and he made a lot of mistakes as we were all watching. We were like, there are some periods in what she wrote, and there are some misspellings and things. But the idea that he could come back 3 days later, after he's transcribed 5 or 10 more pages of this, and he's smarter, right? He knows this hand, he knows the people, and so he could go back and correct his own work, or someone else could come along and read this and say, that doesn't make sense. Let me go look at the source again and see if I can come up with something that seems to match the text and makes more sense. So any of our projects are like that, if they're public projects, anyone with an account can transcribe them, but then also go through and review and edit them.
So as you can see, we transcribed that, and it turns out that reading out loud and presenting and transcribing is hard. So I made a lot of typos. One of the things that we do is that we try to record every stage of the work. So we store a new version every time someone pushes the save button. So you can see we have an original button that was uploaded by the Guild Museum.
Original version.
Right, original version. Then you see my initial transcription that has typos like this capital O, for example, or this from. When I went back and corrected that, we can see the differences. We can see what I fixed. So anything that was removed during this edit is shown as crossed out in red. Anything that was added, like this this U, for example, was added.
So we actually built that for a classicist at UT, University of Texas, where we happen to be in Austin. He was using this for an undergraduate research course, and he would assign people pages of letters to transcribe. Then he would pair them up and have them review each other's work, and he needed a way to see what changes the reviewer had made. And it's come in really useful for a lot of things. There's the medievalists do projects on From the Page, and they like the idea of being able to use it to kind of show and teach pedagogy, so you can see where you messed up and where other people have come and improved it, or maybe the teacher of a pedagogy of a paleography class. So I've been showing the notes and questions field right now. So every page that you work on From the Page has this box at the bottom for notes and questions. What we love about it is that it puts the context of the question with the page. Project owners get an email every night, and it includes things like your new transcribers and what's been done. But one of the big things it includes is all of these notes. And we encourage project owners to go respond to those notes, because it's really important for volunteer transcribers to feel like they're being listened to, that when they have questions, someone's going to respond, that the institution values their time and their efforts enough to listen to them when they ask questions, right?
So it's not just the people running the project who can see notes. Other volunteers, other transcribers can see the notes that are asked. They can answer the questions. They can have conversations about the material. And we try to make that public to anyone who can see a project.
If you scroll up, you'll notice somebody asking, saying, hey, on line 24, there's illegible things here. So that would be almost an invitation for someone else to look at that page and try to work on it.
So we could even look and see, well, what is that on line 24 on that page? Sorry, I clicked on the wrong thing. Let's see if so I actually click on the page. All right, well, line 24 has had
transcribe and you'll get the line numbers.
Has had little to do, I believe. Let's change that.
No, she wrote little, or whoever.
Oh, no, you're right.
There's definitely another
HIT.
But little, no.
Yeah, I would say has had but little to do.
I agree with you. Does this look like a B? Because there's another B boarding.
Yeah, actually it looks very similar.
It looks very much the same.
Okay, well, let's do that then. I actually looked at this beforehand and I could not figure it out. So yeah, let's fix that for them. And we'll save that
first.
So you can see, here we have the original transcriber asked a question, and thanks to this group of people, and specifically Sarah and Christina, we were able to improve this. So volunteers also often will use this opportunity to discuss the material. Let's see, I had a good example here, I think.
Ship's logs, or was it just?
Anyway, this is one of the examples is that lots of times people working on this will do research, and they'll use the notes to say, Mrs. White, Mrs. E.G. Lewis, well, here's where someone went through and wrote a brief biography of who this person is. And I think there's an example from Sandy Spring as well. So that's really the basics of the user-facing part of the tool, right? You have people who work together to transcribe or translate material that's uploaded by institutions, and ideally help each other out, have staff help them out, them help staff out. Are there any questions on this base example? I'm gonna rotate this because it's driving me crazy. If there are, just interrupt, ask in the chat. Meanwhile, let's take a bit of a tour of the other projects that are using this system and the kinds of things that they've chosen to present to their end users. So the South Australian Maritime Museum has run a number of projects that are either diaries of people who are traveling, their travel diaries with somebody who's on a steamer, or in some cases we have military diaries. We have all kinds of diaries associated with nautical travel, right? And these are pretty cool, right? There's They go all the way back to the 19th century. Another organization, this is a historic site, Mount Auburn Cemetery, is transcribing all of their material relating to the historic cemetery and all of the architectural decisions that were made.
They have a lot of landscaping documents, and it's a very interesting organization. It's the only one we have like it that has, you know, it's a cemetery, but then it also is a site, and it has a lot of the documentation around the site's development.
There is a convent in, I believe, Minnesota, that is transcribing the records of Mother Agnes Haslock, who founded the convent. There's some lovely examples here of you know, a sister getting up and spooking the Reverend Father in the middle of the night by dressing up like an angel and knocking on his door and things like that. The Easthampton Library in New York State, this is on Long Island, has a large collection of whaling logs. And so they are bringing people in to transcribe the whaling logs they've got.
So this is actually interesting because whaling logs are surprisingly popular on From the Page, because you get one institution, I think the Nantucket Historical Association was the first one that put up a lot of whaling logs. And then there are fans of whaling, like people who are fans of Moby Dick and that kind of era of American history. And so we have kind of found that we have 2 or 3 institutions now that are all working on whaling things, and transcribers will go from one project to another because it's not all about their relationship with your institution. It's about their relationship with the topic and their passion for the topic. And that's kind of neat to see too. In fact, we got Easthampton because one of their local volunteers had worked on
some of the Nantucket
material, and they're like, you should do this. So that's kind of really cool, right?
So another example, so this is a public library in Fort Worth that has a relatively small special collections, but they've put their special collections up and they've got all the public outreach, you know, and diaries are very easy to understand. So it's a neat way to get local people. There are some smaller colleges. Middlebury College is in New England, and they have a selection of different kinds of materials that they've chosen and put together a number of different projects that range from World War II to scientific text to the Civil War. Another small school, in this case a high school, Phillips Academy, Civil War letters from the founders. Sandy Spring Museum has been doing some amazing job with their archives, and they're working in collaboration with Digital Maryland, which is kind of a statewide consortium that hosts metadata and digital library software for them, and then they can use From the Page to transcribe that material and get it back into both Digital Maryland and their own collections. So
everything we've shown you so far has been kind of textual transcription projects, which is kind of where we started From the Page wise. But then the Council of State Archivists helped fund some new functionality that we call field-based transcription. So what Ben is showing you is a project at the Maryland State Archives to index basically their marriage certificates, which they don't have an electronic index for. So this is super, super important for their researchers that were coming in and frankly looking for marriage certificates for people who were, you know, these are not terribly old. Right. Like people need them for survivor benefits or divorces.
These are for marriages in 1984, so this is not that historical. The difference between this transcription screen and the screen that we saw for the other material with letters and diaries is that they've defined specific fields, because you know, you don't need someone to type, you know, I hereby certify. You know that the marriage certificate has that. You do need them to differentiate between first name, middle name, and last name so they can build a searchable index. So they have asked end users to fill out these fields in this form that they've created. And they configure this on a project by project basis. And then they're going to be able to pull that out as a spreadsheet.
In fact, one of the things that's kind of neat here is, so when they configure this, they can choose what type of fields they want. So most of what we see here is textual, but there's a handful that have little arrows next to them. And they're basically small controlled vocabularies that let you, for county, you want it to be standardized. You know what your counties are, you want to be able to find everything from a certain county. So they pre-fill that as a drop down.
This is, if any of you are familiar with the Missouri State Archives e-volunteer program, this is a very similar need to that system. It's
and yeah, go ahead, Christina.
I was gonna say, yeah, it's basically functions the same. The fact that we already had that is the only reason we didn't use from the page before we got the ledger style. So
Right. So that's the next thing we're going to show you. So this is super exciting, only about a couple months old, is that same kind of field-based transcription. We added the ability to put in a spreadsheet to it. So you can do fields for your headers on a page like this, and then you can configure a spreadsheet to have transcribers work on. This is a lot more dense than most of our other material. We have a number, I don't know, Christina, did you guys configure the screen ruler on this? Can we click on one of those fields?
we did not, because it's actually like column 1 and column 2 are different names. So by the time you got past 40, it wouldn't line up.
That's right.
Okay.
Right.
That
So
makes
some
sense.
projects, if you are super standard in how many rows you have on the page and how your pages were digitized and, a couple of other things like that, you can, we'll actually show a highlight across the page when you're on a particular line in the spreadsheet, and it'll do a kind of a best guess with some fudge factor to show you where you are on the digitized image.
So you can see how John and Christina and the Missouri State Archive staff have configured this project. They have given instructions on screen, right underneath the headers, explaining here's what to do, here's, what do you do about all these blank names? Well, you should copy them, things like that. And then they've also given more specific instructions in the conventions that are displayed below. So they explain, use the original spelling, use additional capitalization. For age, they're able to say, in this document, lots of times you'll see month, day, or fractions for children who are less than a year old. So you can configure this on a project by project basis. And did y'all also update the help and create project specific help? Okay.
No, I don't think so. We added some more details on the about page
Oh, really?
for the,
Here or?
An individual, click on there and hit about.
yeah.
Yeah, how to index the records. Nice. All right.
So this might be a good
I
time.
should copy that information to the help. I hadn't.
Yeah.
This is our first project we've loaded up, so.
How's it going? Like how it looked like if we go look at the Missouri site schedules as a collection, you're almost done with one.
Well, so yeah, so we finished 1850, which is the first project we loaded. That was the first 1,100 pages. And that's the one that, when we exported it, was 87,000 lines.
Wow.
Yeah, that took a while. We had to re-engineer our export to get that, to make that work.
So
Yes.
that one, but once it exported, is 87-ish thousand lines. There's a few things that will get deleted because people left line spaces and stuff in the middle and things like that, but it's 87,000 lines. So we finished 1850. We're working on the data cleanup on kind of the back end. But yeah, 1860 we split into 4 parts because it was such a giant export. We learned that.
Yes.
So now there's no more, they're at like 450 pages per part. So they should be smaller when we go to do anything with them. So we're almost done with part 1 of 1860, and we've loaded and started part 2.
So it looks to me, if I'm looking at your statistics, you've had 100 pages transcribed in the last 7 days, which, knowing what those census records look like, that's really impressive. How did you find people to work on this?
So, I mean, we have the added benefit of having a following and having volunteers. So we started off when we loaded 1850, it was staff and a few of our most trusted volunteers, because we're still working. It was as we were developing and testing a lot of the features. So we didn't want to like send it to everyone. And then as it got a little bit more stable, we were stopping making changes, we called out to more of our volunteers. And then once we were pretty much good to go with the ledger style and kind of moving on to other stuff, we just made Facebook posts, and we've definitely had a few people just through from the page
Great.
join us that don't seem to be tied into our other volunteers. But we regularly have like a couple hundred volunteers who help us with death certificates every year. So I mean, we've got a pretty good following, which helps. But also we have a lot of people on Facebook. Every time we post something to our Facebook page, our 10,000 followers, you know, we get a few more people who at least start a page. They might not finish.
Yes.
Yeah, that's always, you know, you're always going to find a handful of people doing the most of the work. But, you know, just even having a few people, you've got one person has transcribed 400 of these pages, and I know what these pages look like. You know, that's really something.
Well, and I love this because, you know, your top 3 people probably have done as much as everybody else put together. And that's not abnormal, right? I mean, that's kind of how a lot of this type of work goes, is you have, you know, 20% of your people are doing 80% of your work, which means you work really hard to make sure that those people are happy and that they feel valued and they know how much you appreciate what they're doing. So.
You know, and the other people who are coming in and contributing a few things, lots of times those will tell their friends, right? I mean, our very first super volunteer on one of our projects was related to, you know, what was was basically, we had recruited someone who was related to the diarist in this project we were running. And they did about 10 pages and then they got bored. But they told their aunt, we didn't know about this, and their aunt went through and transcribed hundreds and hundreds of pages, went and found more diaries from the same person and had them imaged. And so, you know, the people who are just kind of driving by and doing a bit, they also raise awareness, you know, that they can bring some people in too that really help accomplish the goals.
Yeah. We've also seen some really kind of serendipitous ways that volunteers end up on projects. So on that same project Ben was talking about, so once you have transcriptions in from the page, they are searchable via Google pretty easily. And so we had someone who was doing a vanity search on his name and stumbled across the same name in these diaries. And it turns out it was his great uncle who was the diarist's mailman. So, you know, it's circuitous, but his family was from the same part of Virginia and these other, you know, pieces of it. So he started working on this, and he worked on many pages in that project. And when that was done, he went on to work on a project we had with
the Museum of Vertebrate Zoology at UC Berkeley.
Because he had been a fish statistician in his professional life, and now he was a retiree. I'll go work on this museum work. And then he's now a super volunteer at the Library of Virginia, working on many of their projects. So people really love to do this work, right? Some people do, and they'll go from project to project and find a place that needs their efforts and their skills.
I'm going to step out for just a second and say that, or kind of zoom out and say that this really helps with visibility, because you've got online access to records or objects or those kind of things. And visibility equals funding for those smaller institutions that don't have the good corporate support that we do from the Secretary of State's office here. So if you're saying, how is this relevant to what we do? I mean, I think those two things are really important to a small institution.
Somebody else going to say something? I also, you know, you can start small. I have a whole blog post I wrote recently about kind of doing small projects to prove out that you're capable as an institution of doing this, and to understand what resources you need, and to understand whether you can find volunteers and how much work it is, because sometimes it's easy and maybe sometimes it isn't. But then you can build on those stories. You can say, hey, look, we put up 5 diaries and they were transcribed in this period of time, and here's everything we learned. And yeah, you should fund us to do 50 more, right? Who knows? That's the sort of stories that I think funders really like to hear. They're like, we experimented, we learned a lot, we know we can do this, we just need some funding.
So let's talk about getting data into a crowdsourcing platform and getting it out. So I'm going to take a look at a project that I run that's a property history project, but just as an example. So really the simplest way that, yeah, and this is something I would ask if you're ever considering a crowdsourcing project is how do you get your material in and how do you get the volunteer contributions back out? It's a super important question to ask. So we offer a lot of on-ramps onto the platform. You can upload PDFs full of images. You can upload zip files with folders of images. You can upload zip files of PDFs. There's a lot of different ways to bring material in. We also interact with a number of different digital library systems and collection management systems. So many of them support a standard called IIIF. So if you run eMuseum or
Fedora,
a bunch of other
Content
systems
VM,
like that,
although we have a separate import for that.
then we can you just paste in a URL and your material will come in automatically. That's what Sandy Spring Museum is doing. Not that they're running one of those systems, but Digital Maryland is running systems.
And that makes it super easy and fast because you're not schlepping files around, which is really
Yeah,
nice.
yeah, don't have to actually upload the images. Some smaller institutions use the Internet Archive to host their images and metadata. And that's really fantastic. We can connect directly with those as well.
And that gives you I'm pretty sure the Internet Archive is free for hosting things and you can upload your own materials. That's it's a pretty cost-effective piece of this whole puzzle.
So let's talk about getting material out. So this is that same, the same Jeremiah Graves diaries. And we're just reading this. It's been transcribed and indexed. And so if I click download, then I'm presented with a lot of options, and I'm able to see this because I'm the project owner. Soon, individual researchers will be able to see this if the project owner has turned this on for their project. So we support exports in PDF and Microsoft Word. And if we take a look at one of those, I've got them open in different tabs. So this is a Microsoft Word export that I've opened in Google Docs. So it's the same material, right, that we saw before. This same, Jacob starting to Meadsville, but it's in a MS Word doc format that's pretty easy to deal with and edit if you're producing printed material, or if researchers want to incorporate this into their own work, their own articles, their own publications. We also have two different PDF exports. These are more for archival purposes. So this is a text-only export. And there's another export that is kind of a facing edition where you've got the left-hand page has an image of the manuscript and the right-hand page has the transcribed text. For people who want to do interesting research, we have integration with a couple of external tools for doing digital humanities research. So if we pull things into a tool called Voyant, we can see the same Jacob started to Meadsville text visualized using, you can see how different agricultural terms appear through the text. We're not experts at doing this, so.
It's popular in like digital humanities classrooms. So
Yeah.
It's an interesting way to interact with the text.
Yeah. And we do something similar with a word tree visualizer. So if I look up tobacco, I can see all the time the word tobacco is mentioned in the context. So tobacco at Stony Point, and then the next thing that happened. Or I can reverse this and see what they were doing with the tobacco and the text. So that's getting material out. We could talk about configuration, but
Well, there's a little bit more about getting material out. Can we hit the export screen there? So Past Perfect. So Past Perfect doesn't really support an API for pulling images out that we're aware of. If you are aware of more than that, let us know, and we'll definitely look at that. maybe I know that the Mount Auburn Cemetery we showed us in one of our breeze through projects to show you, they use Past Perfect, and they're doing some work to pull the material from the page back into Past Perfect. I suspect they're doing it with PDFs by hand.
They might also be doing it with plain text. So any of those things that we pulled out. So, we were looking at this this book 10. We can pull that out in plain text, which can be ingested into any kind of, cut and pasted into any system, really. There's just a flat HTML as well. And there are really a lot of options. So we have a way of exporting the entire collection as one big zip file where you'll have a directory for each one of your works, and then different formats within there. So you can see, all the options. We kind of joke that this is like a spaceship control panel here.
But we want you to be able to get your material out and to get it out in a really usable format.
So we're always trying to add more of these.
Yeah. So that's most of our show and tell. We are, if you have other questions, we didn't really show you our indexing feature. It's kind of used by not as many of our projects, but we love it. So if you want to see it, we'll show it to you. If you have questions or just comments, or I have this kind of material, what would you do with it? Sort of things, we can be happy to discuss that.
Yeah, or anything else. I know we have staff. We have a staff member who's like part-time of her job is kind of managing our e-volunteers. And so we've been trying to figure out with all of our projects how much time to monitor. And one of the other features that the Council of State Archivists is working on adding is a reviewer role, so that you can limit who can approve and review editing, because especially since we're doing indexing and not complete transcribing in general for our projects, we have certain formats that we want to be met to fit into our database, and certain rules we want followed, and not all the volunteers follow directions or read the directions. They might follow them if they took the time to read them, but because especially if they're new to the archives and are more from the page and are used to the just type what you see line by line feature, because sometimes on the censuses, which is what we've been doing, sometimes the enumerator puts a period after an initial, and sometimes they don't, but we prefer to be standardized. And so we've been trying to figure out how much time it takes before we add other projects, because to keep people interested, it would be cool if we could have our census projects up and maybe tax list and maybe MSP, if that will fit. That's a huge page. We're not sure that will fit very nicely. We'll see. So we've been kind of spending time trying to figure out what we can manage.
Yeah, and how much time does it take? That's the question we get a lot, and it's one of those things where it's like, well, what you put in is what you get out. So we had one public library who really just kind of threw stuff up, and when they had, this is pre-COVID, when they would have like groups of students come and want to volunteer or something, they would sit them down and in a lab and have them transcribe while on site. And pretty much the rest of what happened just happenstance, and eventually it all got done. That's not really how we recommend that you go about it, but they didn't have a lot of staff to be really monitoring and promoting and doing those, the higher touch pieces. If you want your project done quickly. So our favorite story is another one of the state archives in Alabama, who spearheaded a lot of the work with the field-based transcription. They had World War I service cards, 111,000 of them. And
so you've got an index card for each service member.
Mm-hmm. And they collected
in alphabetical order, divided by county.
I'm not even sure the people were, they were in alphabetical order, divided by
within
county.
Each county.
Within each county, yeah. And so for the World War I centennial, they wanted to index these cards, and then they were going to, be able to re-ingest them into their asset management system as individual items instead of sets of cards. So it was easier to find your ancestor. And and Meredith McDonough there is their digital projects person, and she had such great connections with their local history societies and their local genealogy societies, and those are organized by county as well. So she was able to hook up volunteers to material that they were really passionate about, and they finished that project in 2.5 months. And it was crazy.
It astonished all of us.
Yes.
And their project wasn't even public in the sense that most of the projects are. So one thing we didn't mention is that it's possible to run private projects on From the Page. About probably around a quarter of the activity is on private projects. So you had to ask permission to work on this Alabama project. People
were like, really? You want to do it that way? Okay.
They did, and man, they knocked it out of the park.
Yeah. They had articles in journals that were going to be published 2 or 3 months from when they started, and by the time they were published,
they had to launch another small project to give those volunteers something to work on, because you had people who read the magazine article and contacted them saying, "Oh, I want to do this." Well, that's kind of finished already, but you could do this instead.
So, yeah. When projects are online, it makes it so easy for people to just do it, and especially when it's not as hard as an 80-line census page, you can just get through it.
Yeah, we really had to rethink a lot of how page status and how transcribers interact with an individual page when we went to these ledger style projects, because it's just so much more dense and so much more work for a single page.
Yeah, I mean, the only projects that have similar complexity are some of the medieval manuscripts, in which, you know, they're in another language and full of abbreviations. Those also can take an hour to transcribe a single page. But yeah, the Missouri project with the slave schedules is doing that for everybody.
So do you have anyone that's like adding metadata to images of objects?
So we there was a staff project at Ohio University where they were describing dance posters. So they have a big special collection around dance and the dance program there and kind of the offshoots of it. And so they did a field-based project for their dance posters. So that's kind of along the lines of what you're talking about. Indianapolis Public Library, I don't think it's launched yet, but it's doing a project where they have a bunch of photos but specifically of parks in Indianapolis. So like it's a limited scope. It's like and they're really just trying to say, which park is this? Maybe a little bit of description or something. And they'll do that as a field-based project. From the Page is not the right platform for doing very generic photo identification.
You know, the kind of like Facebook face tagging kind of thing.
I'd love to get it there. Like, or actually, I don't even know that From the Page is the right platform. I actually picture something that's more like Tinder or something, where you're just swiping through pictures, and when you see someone or someplace, you know, you can stop and then do a task on it. But it's that going through a whole bunch of stuff very quickly that our software is not really optimized.
Yeah, we're designed for people concentrating and arguing with each other about what this word is.
Yeah. But the last of actually not the last, but the next of the COSA funded features this year is metadata description. So the ability to, we haven't actually built it yet, so we're not entirely sure how it's going to look, but to, you know, maybe you're transcribing a letter that's got 4 pages, and then you can configure a description page that comes after those 4 pages that says, when was this written, who was it written to, who was it written from, you know the metadata you need for this sort of material. Or maybe you don't transcribe it and you just describe it. So having kind of work level metadata description that is crowdsourceable, and you can do everything, but you can do some, aspects of a document.
The kinds of things that you trust volunteers who have read the entire letter or transcribed the entire letter to do, that it is not necessarily the same kind of metadata description that a staff member would do. But for the things, for the very limited task, we think that that's the kind of thing volunteers will be very good at.
And we also know that archives often have a tremendous backlog of things just to describe so people can find them. Right?
Yeah. And when you have the volume that we tend to have at our level, While it might be nice to have a every word transcription, if you can get the basic information on everything, it makes it so much more accessible than having super detailed information on a few things. So
yeah. So we're excited to see where that kind of ends up going. But I think, John, to your question, you could do that with objects potentially. If you have photographs of a vase or something, maybe you could do a metadata description of that type of object. That would be interesting.
Yeah.
Again, I'm thinking of like Past Perfect, where you got your entire collection, at least thumbnails of them, and people could add some of those details to them, or even edit the details to them. It's a recent metadata thing, but somebody asked me a question about a photograph, and it was someone putting a handle in a splitting maul, and the archivist had actually tagged it as someone sharpening an axe. Well, it wasn't an axe; he wasn't sharpening it, and so maybe the older generation would be better at that than a 20-year-old or a 30-year-old or urban archivist, So and so I can see examples in the three-dimensional world where we maybe bridge that gap.
Yeah, I think that would be really interesting, and I definitely think it could happen. One of the phrases sometimes people use about crowdsourcing is nerd sourcing, because there are people who are much more passionate about a particular area of something, like the ship's logs or the whaling logs, than your professional archivist working on the same material.
Do y'all have those t-shirts for sale for nerd sourcing?
Yeah, I don't know whether our transcribers want to be called nerds. Like, our generation seems to think that's fine, but
folks of our age and younger are cool with it. Folks a little older than us, really not so much.
yeah. I was gonna say, it's a badge of honor once you're like a millennial or a Gen Z.
yes.
Probably even Gen X, I'd say, but
I know at least my parents would not appreciate it.
somehow, I mean, we just made nerds cool, I guess.
Yes, we did.
Yeah.
It's lovely.
So, any other questions from anyone? Is anyone out there using like crowdsourcing or using volunteers to index any of their records?
On site or online?
We do webinars. Our next one is all about the spreadsheet and ledger transcription. So it's not as general audience-y as the one we'll do the month after that, which is what we call your first crowdsourcing project. But once we get that posted, I'll send it to Christina and see if she can pass it along to this group.
It's not a technical deep dive like this was. It really focuses on kind of the soft skill aspects of selecting material or trying to attract volunteers, doing outreach, doing training, those kinds of things.
Because it's hard. It's a different type of
task.
Yeah,
the joke I heard recently among some colleagues that we have in crowdsourcing is, people think crowdsourcing is asking the public to do your homework for you, but in fact, you get assigned a totally new set of homework to, deal with, volunteers and their contributions, the amazing things that they can do, and
the
guidance they need.
We haven't set up any trainings, although we do also have like a one-page how to index this project that we send out via email to our volunteers that we haven't put in, although I might add some of it to the help section. I mean, we put the basics of it on from the page, but we try to send out very more specifically to our volunteers. But we've done in the past, we've done like indexathons, using our death certificates, using the 1940 census, where we've worked with other institutions like genealogical societies and been like, here's how to do it, and had people in a room or like all together kind of walking through how to index a page. So those are things that we might do. Whether or not it's with our collection, we don't know. With the 1950 census coming out soon, there'll probably be, I say soon, like 6 months. There'll probably be some national efforts to index that again. So
gotcha. Yeah, the Library of Virginia does transcribe-a-thons monthly.
Okay.
But they have, I mean, they kind of have a staff that has just, they've worked on it for like 5 years to get to the point where they have a staff member who does nothing but their transcription projects. And they do something else that I would recommend any institution think about. They give service hours. And especially since the pandemic, we've had a lot of inquiries about, oh, who will give, I'd like to do this, can I get service hours? And we try to send them to projects where we know people are willing to give service hours. And right now that's, we only know of
Sandy
two.
Spring and the Library
Yes.
of Virginia,
Yeah. So yeah, so if you give service hours and you can document that somewhere, then that it brings you a younger group of transcribers often.
We've never set up our own thing. We have had people come to us for service hours because they're college students. They need them for their sorority. The DAR, actually, we have a lot of our volunteers who who count us, and we'll just acknowledge, like, whatever, if they give us a form or whatever, we'll acknowledge the work that we have logged, but we've never set up so that we're advertising that hey, that's a thing. But
yeah,
when people have come to us, we've been like, sure, we can.
So does the system record like minutes on page or anything like that?
Yes.
It does.
It does. Yeah. And we really should try to formalize that into something that maybe could be, well, one, we'd love it to be self-serve for the transcribers in some way that they could print out and show someone. And two, to do something slightly more with it, that someone like Christina could say, oh yes, here's who you are. I can click a button and, oh look, here's my signature on a certificate or something. I don't know what would, you tell me what would be useful, but that's, we've been thinking about something like that.
Even for our like annual reports and things like that, we like to document the amount of time volunteers spend on a project, and we don't usually have a way of tracking the number of hours. Like with our death certificates, we say, it took us 5 weeks to index 52,000 certificates with this many volunteers. That's what we say. But if we could say they put in this many hours, like, we know it took, like when our volunteers in-house physically processed the World War II reports of separation, we know it took them 1.5 years, and it was like 2,800 volunteer hours that went into that project. And so we're able to put that in the report, and that's more than one staff person full time to get it done without the volunteers. So we like, if you're creating reports like that, we like reports that tell us, like at the end of a project, the total number of volunteers and the total number of time put into it would be useful information.
So you could get that, I believe.
We show some of this.
Yeah.
You should poke around and look at what we do show, and then you should tell us what exactly you would love to see.
Because I know I've looked at the like the collaborator page, so I've seen, like, you can get to the number of volunteers, but when I was looking, the time seemed to have only shown up within like the last 7 days one, and then the longer you go, it wasn't showing me the amount of time.
You should be able to get that on the spreadsheet download.
Okay.
For each contributor. And again, the amount of time it's rough, right? Because if somebody starts transcribing a page and they go off to lunch and they come back and they finish, well, it looks like they spent 2 hours on one page.
Right. But best we can do.
Right.
We do.
Right. There's no way to get it, perfect, but we could probably come up with an average and just go with that. But I'd just be curious. The number of contributors and the number of pages and the number of names is probably, because right now we're actively spouting the 87,000 names indexed in just a couple months. It's probably longer than it would have been in general, because since we started out just staff, and we're like, okay, everyone do a page and let us know what you think, and then we made some changes, and then okay, everyone do another page, and then.
We recommend that though for all projects too, right? Because it's how you learn and get it right before you unleash the public on it.
We definitely think, this is interesting, because we could add a statistic of the number of records in a project that have been transcribed so far, which is something that.
Oh, like lines.
Yeah, because right now we only track pages,
we only track pages.
but we could totally break that up into number of lines.
Yeah, because we had no idea how many lines it'd be until we exported it, and it took us a little while to export it because it's big. We like broke your system.
So Marcia asks, can you have projects that are private or semi-private? So yes, so you can make a collection on From the Page private, and then people have to sign up for a From the Page account, but once they've done that, you can add them to your project as transcribers.
Then no one else will see that.
Yeah.
So we've seen that used for small research groups. We've seen it used for classrooms. We've seen it used for staff projects, particularly for material under copyright. So at the beginning of the pandemic, lots of research libraries had to send people home, and the Bindicary Library at Yale had a lot of material that was ready to transcribe that was all by people like James Baldwin. You know, it's all literary letters by people whose literary estates are still very active. So it could not be made public because of copyright concerns. But they were able to let just staff members work on that.
So we have also done private projects, or private projects are run on From the Page for like language revitalization projects. So you want to limit the transcription to people who are working on revitalizing a language. So the Lakota Sioux tribe was doing some work there that was really, really cool,
Yeah.
but very, very private. John asks about cost. So From the Page runs, it's an open source software platform that if you have a deep IT staff, you can run yourself. But if your IT staff can't handle words like Ruby on Rails, Unix, MySQL databases, you don't want to go there. You need you need pretty proficient IT staff.
Or if they're not keen on the idea of having their servers accessible by the public.
That's often, we run into that with the state stuff a lot.
Yeah.
And most of our smaller institutions choose to use our software as a service, which is where we run this, the server on fromthepage.com. Our smallest subscription there starts at $80 a month. That's for up to 10,000 pages, but it's a single collection. So you have to kind of, everything has to be configured similarly. You can't do a spreadsheet and a field based and a full text. It all has to be one of those. The next kind of price bump is $300 a month or $3,000 a year, and that's for 50,000 pages, as many collections as you want. And then we have a couple bumps that get slightly cheaper per pages as you go up from there.
As you complete collections, as you complete projects, you can make them inactive, which means they become read-only. You can always get your material out, but they don't count against those page limits anymore. So you can start new ones and just leave the old ones up.
But you can't transcribe them anymore. So, yeah.
So John's asking a wild guess on staff multiplier for how long would it take to type and edit yourselves versus nerd sourced.
How much time are you saving in doing like our death certificates or like these census projects?
Well, I mean, it's a little hard to say because we probably get it done faster because people are doing it all hours of the day and staff have other jobs. So, I mean, I don't think we would want to pull all staff to just do the indexing until it was done. But at the same time, if we don't get it done, as an example, so right now it takes us, with the death certificates, it takes us 4 to 6 weeks, depending on the year, to get a brand new year indexed. But before we had the database built, when we first got the death certificates, in that 1 year, we got 15,000 requests just for death certificates. And that staff time is, we don't have the staff time to spend on that either, making so we probably would have to index it pretty fast. But I don't know that it would be faster because we've got hundreds of volunteers spending, even if they're spending just a little bit of time versus a couple staff members spending all their time. We could probably get it done in a similar amount of time, but it would be so hard.
Yeah, it's so hard.
What you're saying is it would not be staff time, though. That's the advantage, right?
Right. This is less staff. I mean, we still have to spend staff time on admin. Usually a good 20% of the images get still seen and viewed by staff. But it's a significantly less.
Yeah, we always say, that crowdsourcing is not a way to it's not free labor, right? It's not a way to make staff projects cheaper because they're done by volunteers. It's at all, right? It is a way to make projects that you wouldn't be able to do otherwise possible.
Yeah.
Right. There's still a cost of labor, but often, very few memory institutions are going to have staff members editing every word of documents, but volunteers will do that.
And it's also, how much time do you have to spend reviewing is one of these interesting open questions. What did we hear about the Library of Congress's transcription?
They review 5% of what the public transcribes.
And it depends on how important are your transcriptions? How accurate do they need to be? Maryland reviews every single one of those marriage certificates because they need to be right. But if you're just transcribing letters
from 200 years ago?
Yeah.
Right now,
transcription better than none?
We're reviewing all the pages, although I say that we're not, because we're indexing age and race and gender. I'm not reviewing those unless there's something obvious wrong about the line. I'm not verifying that. We can change it later if someone points out an error. But at the same time, we're also trying to figure out how to train and figure out which volunteers would be good reviewers, because if we can make them reviewers, that's cooler. And then we'll just do the data cleanup at the end for things that are like weird anomalies, or people have added notes, or they just don't fit in the data set that came out, and we need to double check it to make sure it goes into our database properly when we load it into that final public.
And we're hoping that the last COSA feature will help you highlight and fix those before you get them out of the system. Hopefully, that's the hope.
Yeah.
So, okay. It's now 2:35. So if we don't have any other questions, thank you for joining us, Ben and Sara. I enjoyed talking about the project that
Thank you for
we
having
spent
us.
a lot of time thinking about this year.
We really appreciate your invitation.
All right. If you guys end up with any questions, you can shoot me an email. And I can help answer any questions. You can reach Ben and Sara at fromthepage.com and they can answer questions. We're happy to help. Thank you, everyone. Have a great day.
Thanks,
Thank
everybody.
you.
Ben, I did have one question for you. So with our export, just while I have you here, totally
Sure,
Yeah, anytime.
Are we still recording?
We are still recording, but that's okay.
Linda can edit this out. She can stop it with the goodbye. So when I exported, and I'm sure it's a CSV